When Sergeant Elena Torres returned from war, she expected tears, joy, and her loyal canine partner, Ranger, waiting with wagging tail. But what she found was heartbreaking. A dog once trained to save lives, now chained, starved, and forgotten. In that moment, something inside her snapped. What she did next not only stunned her community, it started a movement. This is the unbelievable true story of courage, redemption, and a woman's fight to free the one soul who never gave up on her. Stay with us, because what unfolds will leave you in tears and inspired to act. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see this community come together. If you enjoy powerful stories, subscribe and hit the bell. Now, let's dive in. The air in Kentucky tasted different. It was thick, humid, and green, a living thing that clung to the skin and filled the lungs with the smell of damp earth, honeysuckle, and the faint, sweet perfume of decaying leaves. For Sergeant Elena Torres, it was the scent of a life she'd almost forgotten existed. After 3 tours, the last a grueling deployment in the dust-choked, sun-scorched landscape of Syria, the relentless green of her home state was a shock to the system. It was so vibrant, it almost hurt to look at. She steered her beat-up Ford pickup along the winding 2-lane blacktop, the tires humming a familiar song on the pavement. The Daniel Boone National Forest crowded the road on both sides, a dense tapestry of oak, hickory, and pine that rose into rolling hills, their peaks softened by a hazy blue mist. This was home, Morehead, Kentucky, a place where time seemed to flow like the lazy Licking River, slow and unhurried. It was the place she had fled at 18, eager for a world bigger than the one contained by these ancient hills. Now, at 29, it was the only sanctuary she could think of. Her hands, calloused and capable, gripped the steering wheel. They were hands that had learned to field dress a wound in the back of a jolting Humvee, to fire a rifle with steady precision, and to soothe the bristling fur of a nervous, 4-legged soldier. It was the last of these tasks that her heart ached for now. Her discharge papers were tucked into a folder on the passenger seat, a thin manila file that felt laughably inadequate to summarize nearly a decade of her life. Honorable discharge, combat medic, K9 handler, words on a page. They couldn't capture the bone-deep weariness that had settled into her soul, a fatigue that no amount of sleep could cure. They couldn't explain the phantom sensation of sand in her eyes, or the way a car backfiring could send a jolt of pure, white-hot adrenaline through her veins. She was heading to her grandmother's old farmhouse, a place bequeathed to her after Nana Rose had passed away during her second tour. Elena hadn't been able to come back for the funeral, a fact that sat like a stone in her gut. The house had been waiting for her, empty and silent, for over 4 years. A local property manager had kept the pipes from freezing and the lawn from turning into a jungle. But it wasn't a home, not yet. A home needed a heartbeat, and the heartbeat she craved belonged to Ranger. Her mind drifted, as it so often did, to him. Ranger, a Belgian Malinois, with a coat the color of burnt caramel and eyes so intelligent they seemed to peer right through you. He wasn't just a dog. In the chaotic, terrifying theater of war, he had been her partner, her shadow, her early warning system, and on more than one occasion, her confessor. He was a military working dog, specialized in explosives detection. But to Elena, he was the other half of her soul. She remembered the day they were paired. He was a bundle of coiled energy and sharp-toothed defiance. She was a young medic, barely out of her teens, trying to prove she was tough enough. They had clashed, tested each other's limits, and in doing so, had forged a bond stronger than steel. She knew the exact pitch of his whine when he was bored, the subtle shift in his posture when he caught a scent no human could detect, the comforting weight of his head on her lap during the long, tense silences between missions. He had saved her life. It wasn't a dramatic movie-style moment. It was quiet, almost mundane, a routine patrol through a village that intelligence had cleared. Ranger, walking point 10 feet ahead of her, suddenly stopped. He didn't bark or growl. He simply froze, one paw lifted, his body a rigid statue of concentration. The air went still. Elena trusted the dog more than she trusted any intel. She'd quietly signaled the team back, her heart hammering against her ribs. A remote detonation by the EOD team later revealed a daisy chain of IEDs, sophisticated and deeply buried, right where their convoy was meant to pass. He had saved them all, and he'd done it with nothing more than a subtle change in his posture. Their partnership had been severed 2 years ago. An ambush, a firefight, shrapnel that had torn through the air like angry hornets. One piece had caught Ranger in the hip. It hadn't been life-threatening, but it had ended his career. The limp would be permanent. The explosive movements required for his job now impossible. He was retired from service. Elena, still with a year left on her contract, had been devastated. The military had protocols, but they were cold and bureaucratic. Retired K9s were often put up for adoption. The thought of Ranger ending up with strangers, people who wouldn't understand the complex, brilliant mind behind those intelligent eyes, was unbearable. So she had made an arrangement. Through a veterans network, she'd found a family in her hometown. The man, Bill Henderson, was a Marine vet. He'd talked a good game on the phone. "We get it, Sergeant," he'd said, his voice full of what she'd mistaken for empathy. "We know what these dogs mean. He'll have a good home with us, plenty of space to run. We'll take care of him like one of our own until you get back." The first year, it had seemed perfect. They sent photos, Ranger lounging on a porch swing, Ranger chasing a ball in a wide green yard. They sent emails with little updates. "He's settling in great. Loves the kids." Then, the updates had become less frequent. The photos stopped. Elena, caught in the whirlwind of her final tour, had told herself it was fine. They were busy. Ranger was settled. He had a life now. She was the one who was far away, a ghost from his past. But the dream of their reunion had been a constant, flickering flame in the darkness of her deployment. It was the thought she held on to during rocket attacks, the memory she summoned when patching up a wounded soldier, his lifeblood slick on her gloves. She imagined it in vivid detail. She would pull up to their house, and he would hear the rumble of her truck's engine. He would bark that deep, familiar woof that was more of a chest-rattling announcement than a sound. He would come bounding out, his gait maybe a little uneven, but his spirit undimmed. He would leap, and she would catch him, burying her face in his familiar-smelling fur. And everything would finally be okay. The turn-off for her grandmother's property came up on the left. Elena flicked on the blinker and guided the truck down a long gravel driveway, the stones crunching under the tires. The farmhouse came into view, a simple 2-story white clapboard house with a wide front porch. It looked smaller than she remembered and lonelier. She killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was absolute, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the wind. She got out, her boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. She walked up the steps, the wood groaning in protest, and used the old key the property manager had mailed her. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of dust and disuse. Sunlight streamed through the grimy windows, illuminating floating dust motes in golden shafts. It was a time capsule. Nana Rose's floral armchair was still in the corner, a faded afghan draped over its back. The cuckoo clock on the wall was silent, its hands frozen at 3:30. Elena dropped her duffel bag on the floor. The sound echoed in the stillness. She walked through the small house, her footsteps loud on the hardwood floors. This was it. She was home. But the feeling was hollow, a dull ache in the center of her chest. This wasn't home. Home was a feeling, a connection. And the most vital part of her home was still missing. She pulled out her phone, her thumb hovering over the contact for Bill Henderson. Her heart began to beat a little faster, a flutter of anticipation and nerves. They lived just a few miles away, on the other side of the creek. She could be there in 10 minutes. The dream of the reunion, so long a distant fantasy, was suddenly within reach. She took a deep breath, the dusty air filling her lungs. First, she would drop off her gear. Then, she would go get her boy. She grabbed a small bag from her truck, one she had packed specifically for this moment. Inside was a brand new collar, a sturdy leash, and a bag of his favorite jerky treats. Everything was ready. The perfect homecoming was about to begin. The 10-minute drive to the Hendersons' house felt longer than her flight from Germany. Every tick of the engine, every curve in the road, stretched time into a taut, humming wire of anticipation. Elena's palms were slick on the steering wheel. She pictured his face, the way his ears would perk up, the little snuffing sound he made when he was excited. She had replayed this moment in her mind 1,000 times, a cherished film reel that had gotten her through the darkest nights. The Hendersons' place was exactly as she remembered from the photos they'd sent. A neat, single-story ranch house painted a cheerful yellow, set on a few acres of well-manicured lawn. A white picket fence framed the front yard, and a minivan was parked in the driveway. It was the picture of peaceful, rural domesticity. It looked safe. She pulled her truck in behind the minivan and cut the engine. For a moment, she just sat there, gathering herself. The bag with the new collar and treats was on the passenger seat, a tangible promise of the joy to come. She grabbed it and swung herself out of the cab, her boots landing softly on the gravel. She walked up the concrete path to the front door. There were potted ferns hanging from the porch eaves and a welcome mat that read, "Home is where the heart is." She rang the doorbell, a cheerful, 2-note chime. She could hear movement inside, the muffled sound of a television. She waited, a smile already forming on her lips. No one came. She shifted her weight, the smile faltering slightly. She could still hear the TV. A curtain in the front window twitched, a flicker of movement, quickly gone. A knot of unease, small but cold, began to form in her stomach. This wasn't part of the dream. She rang the bell again, holding it down a little longer this time. Finally, the lock clicked and the door opened a few inches. A man's face appeared in the gap. Bill Henderson. He was heavier than in his old Marine Corps photo, his face fleshy and his eyes evasive. "Yeah," he said. He didn't open the door any wider. "Bill, it's Elena Torres. I called last week. I'm back." Recognition, followed by a flicker of something else, panic, crossed his face. "Oh, right. Torres. Didn't expect you today." "My flight got in early," she said, her voice bright, trying to push past the strange awkwardness of the encounter. "I couldn't wait. How is he? Is he here?" Just then, from the backyard, a sound cut through the air. A bark, but it wasn't the strong, confident bark she knew. This was a desperate, hoarse, frantic sound, a sound of distress. The knot in Elena's stomach tightened into a cold fist. Bill's eyes darted away from hers, toward the back of the house. "Look, now's not a great time," he started, his voice low and rushed. "The wife's not feeling well. Maybe you could come back tomorrow." "I just want to see him, Bill," Eleanor insisted, her own voice losing its cheerful edge. The desperate barking continued, rhythmic and raw. "Is that him? He doesn't sound right." He's been a handful," Bill stammered, blocking the doorway with his body. A woman, presumably his wife Linda, appeared behind him, her face pale and pinched. She wouldn't meet Elena's eyes. "Got a bit of an aggressive streak we didn't know about. He's better off outside, get some air." The excuses were a smokescreen, thin and foul-smelling. Elena's internal alarms, honed by years of threat assessment, were screaming. The dream of a joyful reunion evaporated, replaced by a chilling dread. "I'm seeing my dog," she said. It wasn't a request. She pushed past him. He offered only token resistance, his bulk surprisingly soft. Linda scurried out of the way. Elena strode through the living room, past a big screen TV and scattered toys, her eyes fixed on the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. The barking was louder now, closer. It was a sound of pure misery. She slid the door open and stepped outside, and the world stopped. Her blood ran cold, freezing in her veins. The scene before her was a tableau from a nightmare. The manicured lawn of the front yard was a lie. The backyard was a patch of churned mud and weeds. In the center of it, tethered to a rusted metal stake driven into the ground, was a dog. But it wasn't Ranger. Not the Ranger she knew. This was a skeletal caricature, a ghost of the magnificent animal she had left in their care. He was chained. A heavy, rusted logging chain was clipped to a filthy collar that had worn the fur and skin on his neck raw. The chain was short, giving him only a few feet of movement in any direction. The circle of his world was mud, his own filth trampled into the ground. He was emaciated. His ribs and hip bones jutted out at sharp, painful angles, his powerful muscles wasted away to nothing. His beautiful caramel coat was matted with mud and feces, with bold pink patches of irritated skin showing through. An overturned plastic bucket, cracked and green with algae, was the only sign of a water source. There was no food bowl. There was no shelter from the relentless Kentucky sun or the driving rain. The hoarse, desperate barking was coming from him. He was throwing himself against the end of the chain, choking himself with each lunge, his eyes wild with a despair so profound it was almost human. Eleanor couldn't breathe. The air had been sucked from her lungs. This was not neglect. This was torture. This was a deliberate, systematic breaking of a noble spirit. The dream of their reunion, the warm welcome, the wagging tail, it all shattered into a million pieces, replaced by a rage so pure and cold it felt like ice flowing through her. She took a slow step forward. "Ranger," she whispered, her voice cracking. At the sound of her voice, the dog froze. The frantic barking stopped. He stood trembling, his head low, his breathing a series of ragged, choking gasps. He slowly, hesitantly lifted his head. His eyes, once so bright and intelligent, were dull, clouded with pain and hopelessness. But as they focused on her, a flicker of something ancient and deep sparked within them. Recognition. Elena dropped the bag she was holding. The new collar and treats fell into the mud, a mockery of her naive expectations. She moved slowly, her training kicking in. Don't startle a traumatized animal. She held out her hand, palm open. "Hey, buddy," she said softly, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Hey, soldier, it's me. It's Mom." She used the old words, the familiar cadence they had shared in the quiet moments on deployment. She knelt in the mud, not caring about the filth that soaked into the knees of her jeans. Ranger took a hesitant step toward her, his back leg dragging with the familiar limp. He stopped, unsure, as if he couldn't trust his own senses. He let out a low whimper, a sound so full of pain and confusion, it broke Elena's heart clean in two. "It's okay," she crooned, her voice gentle. "I'm here now. I'm here." That was all it took. The last wall of his broken spirit crumbled. He stumbled forward, the heavy chain dragging through the mud, and collapsed, placing his head directly into her lap. He didn't have the energy to wag his tail, to lick her face, to do any of the things she had dreamed of. He just lay there, shivering, his bony head a dead weight in her lap, and a long, shuddering sigh escaped his body. It was a sound of surrender, of a pain too deep to carry alone any longer. Elena wrapped her arms around his frail body, burying her face in his filthy, matted fur. The stench of infection and neglect filled her senses, but she didn't care. She felt the sharp ridges of his spine, the jutting angles of his hips. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent, soaking into his coat. The joyful reunion was a lie. This was a rescue. And the war, she realized, had followed her home. The grief that had shattered Elena was a flash flood, violent and overwhelming. But in its wake, something else rose to the surface. It was cold, hard, and familiar. It was the focus of a combat medic arriving at a mass casualty event. Triage, stabilize, act. Emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. She looked up from Ranger's trembling form, her tear-streaked face a mask of glacial fury. Bill and Linda were hovering by the sliding glass door, their expressions a pathetic mix of fear and defensive self-pity. "Get me a pair of bolt cutters," Elena said, her voice devoid of any warmth. It was the voice of command. Bill blinked. "Now hold on a minute. You have 5 seconds to get me bolt cutters, or I will start taking your fence apart with my bare hands to find something to break this chain," she said, her gaze locking onto his. 5, 4. Bill flinched as if struck. He exchanged a panicked look with his wife, then scurried off toward a shed in the corner of the yard. Elena turned her attention back to Ranger. She stroked his head, her fingers gently probing the raw, infected skin around the collar. "I'm getting you out of here, buddy," she whispered, her voice for him alone, soft and reassuring. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm never leaving you again." Bill returned, holding out a pair of large, red-handled bolt cutters. He wouldn't get close enough to hand them to her, instead placing them on the edge of the muddy circle. Elena snatched them up. She positioned the powerful jaws around a link in the rusted chain. It was thick, meant for towing vehicles, not restraining an animal. She squeezed the handles with all her strength. Her muscles, honed by years of physical training, screamed in protest. With a loud, sharp snap, the link broke. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet yard. The weight of the severed chain fell away. Ranger was free from his anchor, but he didn't seem to realize it. He just continued to lie there, his head in her lap. Elena stood up, her legs shaking with adrenaline. "I'm taking him," she announced to the silent couple by the door. Linda Henderson finally found her voice, thin and reedy. "You can't just do that. He's our dog now. We have the paperwork." Elena laughed, a short, sharp, bitter sound. "Paperwork? You think your paperwork matters more than this?" She gestured around the squalid patch of mud, at the broken bucket, at the skeletal dog at her feet. "You think any judge in this country is going to look at this animal and say he belongs to you. He was aggressive, Bill blurted out, taking a step forward. He tried to bite our kid. We had no choice. He was aggressive? Elena's voice dropped to a dangerously quiet level. She took a step toward them, and they both instinctively recoiled. This dog served his country. This dog saved my life. He is a trained, disciplined soldier. The only thing that would make him aggressive is fear, pain. What did you do to him? They had no answer. They just stared, their faces pale with guilt. Elena knew arguing with them was pointless. They were cowards, and cowards only understood one thing: authority. Her training kicked in again. The protocol for any crisis situation: observe, orient, decide, act. She had observed. She had oriented. Now, it was time to act. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when she spoke, was the calm, professional tone she used on the radio during a mission. I am now documenting this situation, she said clearly, aiming the phone's camera at Bill and Linda, then panning slowly across the yard, lingering on the chain, the stake, and finally on Ranger's pitiful condition. The date is September 14th. The location is the Henderson residence in Moorhead, Kentucky. I am Sergeant Elena Torres, United States Army, retired. This is Military Working Dog Ranger, also retired. I am documenting evidence of extreme animal cruelty and neglect. The Hendersons stared at the phone as if it were a loaded weapon. Please don't, Linda whispered, her hands twisting in the hem of her shirt. We can work this out. Elena ignored her. Keeping the camera recording, she dialed a number from memory. Rowan County Sheriff's Office, how can I help you? A calm dispatcher's voice answered. My name is Sergeant Elena Torres, Elena said, her voice firm and clear. I'm a veteran. I'm at the Henderson residence on Creek Road. I am reporting a severe case of animal abuse concerning a retired military working dog. The animal is emaciated, injured, and has been illegally tethered. I have video evidence. I require immediate assistance. She gave the address. The weight of her military title, the precision of her language had the desired effect. Yes, ma'am, the dispatcher said, her tone now sharp with urgency. We'll have a deputy there as soon as possible. Elena disconnected and immediately dialed another number. Rowan County Animal Control. She repeated her report, just as calm, just as professional. She detailed Ranger's condition, mentioning the sores, the malnutrition, the lack of food and water. She explained his status as a retired K9 and her legal standing as his designated handler and adopter upon her return. When she hung up, the silence in the backyard was thick and heavy. The Hendersons hadn't moved. They looked trapped. Eleanor didn't engage with them further. She went back to Ranger, sitting on the ground beside him, creating a protective bubble around them. She shielded him with her body as if to protect him from the very air of this place. She whispered to him, nonsense words, old commands, promises for the future, a warm bed, good food, walks in the forest, no more chains. He responded with a weak thump-thump-thump of his tail against the mud. It was the most beautiful sight she had ever seen. Within 15 minutes, a sheriff's cruiser crunched to a halt in the driveway. A deputy, a tall man with a kind face and a weary expression, stepped out. He was followed closely by a van from Animal Control, from which a woman in a khaki uniform emerged, her face already set in a grim line. The deputy approached cautiously. Folks, I'm Deputy Miller. We got a call about a dispute. Elena stood up, brushing the mud from her jeans. There's no dispute, Deputy, she said. There's a crime. Bill and Linda immediately started talking over each other, a torrent of excuses and accusations. "She's trespassing. He's our dog. He's dangerous." Deputy Miller held up a hand for silence. He looked from the frantic couple to the calm, uniformed woman standing in their yard. Then his eyes fell on Ranger. He stopped. His professional demeanor cracked for a fraction of a second, replaced by an expression of pure human shock. The animal control officer, whose name was Sarah, pushed past him and knelt where Elena had been, her movements gentle and practiced. "Oh, you poor boy," she murmured, her expert eyes taking in every detail of Ranger's condition. Elena presented her case with military precision. She showed Deputy Miller the video on her phone. She swiped to photos from her time in Syria. Ranger, proud and healthy, sitting by her side in a Black Hawk. Ranger, alert and focused, receiving a medal for his service. She showed them her military ID and the digital copies of Ranger's service and retirement records, which clearly stipulated the foster agreement and her right to reclaim him. The contrast was undeniable. The hero in the photos was a world away from the broken animal lying in the mud. "He has sores on his neck from the chain," Eleanor said, her voice tight. "He's severely malnourished and dehydrated. This didn't happen overnight." Deputy Miller's face hardened. He looked at Bill Henderson, his gaze now cold. "You want to explain this to me, sir?" Bill's bluster evaporated, leaving behind a pathetic, whining man. The story of the aggressive dog and the biting incident crumbled under the deputy's pointed questions. Sarah, the animal control officer, stood up, her face a mask of controlled anger. "This is one of the worst cases of neglect I've seen in years," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "The dog's condition, the tethering, the lack of adequate food, water and shelter. This is a clear violation of state and county animal cruelty laws." She looked directly at Elena. "Based on the evidence of abuse and your documented history as his handler, I am granting you emergency custody of this animal, pending a full investigation and cruelty charges against the Hendersons." Relief washed over Elena so powerfully her knees almost buckled. It was over. He was safe. Deputy Miller turned to the Hendersons. "You two are to remain here. We have a lot more to talk about." Elena didn't wait to hear the rest. She knelt and unclipped the filthy, heavy collar from Ranger's neck. The act felt profoundly symbolic, a release from bondage. She looped the new, clean leash she'd brought over his head. "Okay, buddy," she whispered. "Let's go home." Ranger was weak, his legs trembling. Elena put her arm under his belly to support him, and together they slowly walked out of that yard of horrors. She didn't look back. She guided him to her truck and carefully helped him onto the passenger seat. He collapsed onto the worn fabric, exhausted. As she drove away, leaving the flashing lights of the cruiser and the wreckage of the Hendersons' lives behind her, she reached over and laid her hand on Ranger's bony side. She could feel the faint, rhythmic rise and fall of his breathing. It was the steadiest, most reassuring sound in the world. The real homecoming had just begun. The farmhouse was quiet when they arrived. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the overgrown yard, painting the world in hues of gold and amber. The silence inside the truck was a fragile, sacred thing. Elena carried Ranger from the cab, his surprising lightness a fresh stab to her heart, and brought him through the front door of her grandmother's house. She gently set him down on a soft rug in the living room. He stood there for a moment, swaying on his feet, his eyes darting around the unfamiliar space before collapsing onto the rug with a weary sigh. The reality of the task ahead settled upon Elena. This wasn't just about feeding a skinny dog. This was about rebuilding a life from the ground up. His, and she was beginning to realize, her own. The first stop, The very next morning was the vet. Dr. Adams was a kind, no-nonsense woman in her late 60s with gentle hands and eyes that had seen it all. She spent nearly 2 hours with Ranger. The official diagnosis was a brutal list of ailments that Elena wrote down in a notebook, her handwriting tight and angry. Severe malnutrition, advanced dehydration, heartworm disease, multiple skin infections, both bacterial and fungal, anemia, parasites, and, Dr. Adams added softly, looking at Elena with compassionate eyes, profound psychological trauma. The physical things we can fix, the vet said, outlining a meticulous plan of medicated baths, antibiotics, dewormers, and a careful re-feeding schedule of small, high-calorie meals 6 times a day. The heartworm is serious, but treatable. It will be a long, slow process. But his spirit, that's where you come in, Sergeant. He's going to need more than medicine. And so, their new mission began. The days fell into a quiet, healing rhythm, dictated not by the bugle calls and mission briefings of the army, but by the needs of a broken dog. Elena's life, which had felt so vast and empty upon her return, now had a singular, powerful focus. She fed him his small meals, spooning the softened food into a bowl and watching to make sure he didn't eat too fast and make himself sick. She gave him his pills, hiding them in tiny morsels of chicken, a trick he quickly figured out but tolerated with weary patience. The first bath was an ordeal. She carried him into the walk-in shower, and at the first touch of the warm water, he flinched violently, his body trembling. Elena's heart broke for him. What horrors did he associate with water? A hose being turned on him as punishment, being left out in the cold, driving rain. She didn't speak, but instead just held him, letting the warm water run over them both, her hands moving in long, slow, soothing strokes. After a few minutes, he seemed to understand. He leaned his weight against her, and for the first time, relaxed into her touch, a silent concession of trust. As she gently lathered the medicated shampoo into his ravaged skin, cleaning away the layers of filth and infection, she felt as though she were washing away her own pain. The hypervigilance that had been her constant companion in Syria, the state of being perpetually on edge, found a new, healthier purpose. She monitored his breathing while he slept. She watched for any sign of discomfort or pain. She became a student of his recovery, her focus narrowed to this one precious life. Her own healing happened in parallel, so quietly she barely noticed it at first. The sleepless nights, once filled with the jarring, fragmented images of war, the flash of an explosion, the face of a wounded comrade, were now spent on a mattress on the living room floor next to Ranger. When a nightmare threatened to pull her under, she would reach out in the darkness and lay her hand on his flank. The simple, rhythmic rise and fall of his breathing was an anchor, a living metronome that tethered her to the peaceful present and kept the ghosts of the past at bay. One afternoon, while she was carefully applying a salve to a particularly nasty sore on his hip, the sunlight from the window caught the faint, silvery lines of a shrapnel scar on her own forearm. She looked from her scar to his, a mirror of their shared history. Both of them were soldiers, wounded in different ways by the same war. Both of them were survivors. In that quiet moment, sitting on the floor of her grandmother's dusty farmhouse, she felt a bond of understanding with him that transcended species. They were two broken veterans, slowly, painstakingly, putting each other back together. As Ranger's physical strength began to return, Elena knew they needed to reclaim the world outside the four walls of the house. Their first walk was just to the end of the driveway and back. Ranger's gait was stiff, his limp pronounced, but he held his head a little higher. The next day, they made it to the edge of the woods. The Daniel Boone National Forest, which had felt so menacing and alien to her upon her return, began to transform. At first, every snapped twig sounded like a cracking rifle, every shadow a potential threat. But walking with Ranger changed her perception. She was forced to slow down, to see the world through his recovering senses. He was rediscovering what it meant to be a dog, not a soldier. He sniffed with intense concentration at a rabbit trail. He watched a fat squirrel chatter at him from an oak branch, his tail giving a tentative, interested wag. One warm afternoon, they walked down to the creek that bordered the property. After a moment of hesitation, Ranger waded into the cool, clear water, lapping at it eagerly. He was learning to be a dog again, and Elena, watching him, was learning to be a person again, separate from the soldier she had been for so long. The forest was no longer a potential battleground, it was a sanctuary. Slowly, the farmhouse began to transform as well. It was no longer just her grandmother's house, a silent monument to a past she'd missed. It was their home. Elena found herself fixing a loose shutter, weeding the overgrown flower beds, planting a small vegetable garden by the back porch. Ranger found his favorite spot, a patch of sun on the porch where he could doze in the afternoon, his nose twitching at the scents carried on the breeze. The silence of the house was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft padding of paws on the hardwood floor, the jingle of a collar, the contented sighs of a sleeping dog. It was a peaceful silence, a healing silence. One evening, about 2 months after the rescue, Elena was sitting on the porch swing, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. Ranger was lying at her feet, his head resting on her boots. He had gained weight, his coat was growing back thick and glossy, and his eyes were clear and bright. He looked up at her, and his tail gave a strong, steady thump, thump, thump against the wooden planks of the porch. It was a simple, happy sound. Elena smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She was home. They both were. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt a flicker of hope, not just for survival, but for a future she was building, one quiet, healing day at a time. Months bled into a year. The seasons turned, painting the Kentucky hills in the fiery hues of autumn, blanketing them in the quiet white of winter, and reawakening them with the vibrant green of spring. With each passing season, Ranger's transformation became more complete. He was no longer a ghost. He was a dog, whole and happy. The powerful muscles had returned to his frame. His coat was a glossy river of caramel, and his limp was now just a part of his jaunty, confident gait. The scars remained, faint white lines on his skin, and a lingering watchfulness in his eyes, but they were reminders of a battle won, not a life sentence of pain. Elena had changed too. The hard, brittle edges of her grief and anger had been worn smooth by the daily rhythm of care and companionship. She slept through the night now, her dreams, more often filled with peaceful walks in the woods than the chaotic echoes of war. The haunted, faraway look in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, steady presence. She had stopped surviving and had started living. But as the urgent, all-consuming task of Ranger's recovery wound down, a familiar restlessness began to stir within her. She was a soldier, a medic. She was trained to have a mission, a purpose. Caring for Ranger had been that mission. Now she felt a pull to do more, to extend the circle of their small, quiet sanctuary. On a whim, she started volunteering at the Moorhead Animal Refuge, the same county shelter whose officer had helped her that fateful day. At first, she kept to herself, finding a strange comfort in the mindless, physical labor of cleaning kennels, hauling bags of food, and walking dogs. She didn't talk much about her past. She didn't have to. There was a quiet competence about her, a calm authority that the animals seemed to sense. The shelter staff noticed. They saw how the most fearful, traumatized dogs, the ones who cowered and snarled in the back of their cages, would often settle under her patient, gentle hand. She knew not to push, not to force. She knew how to sit quietly and just be present, letting the animal come to her. She understood their language of fear, because she had spoken it herself. The shelter manager, a pragmatic woman named Maria, saw something special in Elena. One afternoon, as Elena was sitting in a run with a terrified beagle mix who had been rescued from a hoarding situation, Maria approached her. "We're having a small community adoption event next month," Maria said, leaning against the chain-link fence. "I was wondering if you'd be willing to say a few words, maybe tell your story, Ranger's story." Elena's first instinct was to refuse. The story felt intensely private, a sacred pact between her and her dog. To speak of it felt like exposing a wound. But then she looked down at the beagle, who had finally crept forward to sniff her outstretched hand, and she thought of Ranger, now dozing peacefully in the cab of her truck. Their healing had been possible because someone had intervened. Maybe their story could be that intervention for someone else. "Okay," she said quietly, "I'll do it." The day of the event, Elena was terrified. But as she stood before the small crowd of families and local community members, with Ranger sitting calmly and proudly at her side, the fear subsided. She didn't use notes, she just spoke from the heart. She told them about the bond forged in the dust of Syria, the promise she had made, the horrifying discovery in that muddy backyard, and the slow, quiet journey back to health and trust. She didn't focus on the anger or the horror. She focused on the healing. As she spoke, she played a short video she had taken on her phone the week before. It showed Ranger not as a victim, but as a victor, bounding through a field of wildflowers, chasing a ball with joyful abandon, his body a picture of strength and freedom. The story, raw and honest and powerful, landed with a quiet force. When she finished, the silence was broken by applause, but also by tears. People came up to her afterward, not just to pet Ranger, but to thank her, to share their own stories of rescue and resilience. A reporter from the local paper was there, and her small article was picked up by a regional news network. They ran a short segment, contrasting the photos of Ranger in service with the video of his rescue and his subsequent recovery. From there, it exploded. In the digital age, a powerful story can travel at the speed of light. The video went viral. It was shared on veterans forums, on animal rescue pages, on national news sites. The narrative of the female soldier who came home from war only to fight one more battle for her canine partner resonated deeply with millions. Elena's phone, which had been silent for so long, began to ring incessantly. But it wasn't just news outlets. The calls were from organizations whose names she knew and deeply respected. Wounded Warrior Project, Mission Canine Rescue, the U.S. War Dogs Association. They had all seen the story, and they saw what Maria the shelter manager had seen. Not just a victim, but a leader. One afternoon, a call came from a woman who introduced herself as a representative for a coalition of veteran and animal welfare groups. "Sergeant Torres," the woman said, her voice warm and direct, "we've been following your story. More than that, we've spoken to Maria at the Moorhead shelter. She tells us you have a gift with the dogs nobody else can reach, the ones with trauma." I think I understand them," Elena said, sitting on her porch steps, Ranger's head resting on her knee. "We think so too," the woman replied, "and we think you could be doing more than just volunteering. We see a need, and we see you. We'd like to offer you a seed grant. Not a handout," she added quickly, "but an investment. We want to invest in you, to see if you can build something bigger here, to help others like you, and others like Ranger." The conversation was a spark hitting dry tinder. An idea which had been lying dormant in the back of her mind, a vague, unformed wish, began to take shape and catch fire. What if the healing she and Ranger had found wasn't unique? What if their journey was a map that others could follow? What if she could pair veterans, men and women wrestling with the invisible wounds of war, with rescue dogs, animals who had their own scars and their own deep capacity for loyalty and love? The pieces clicked into place with a sudden, stunning clarity. She would create a program. It would be small, local, and deeply personal. It would operate right here, from her farm, in partnership with the Moorhead Animal Refuge. It would match the right dog with the right veteran, and then guide them both through the slow process of building trust and finding peace. She knew in that moment what it would be called. "Hearts Unleashed," she said into the phone, the words tasting new and powerful on her tongue. It was about unchaining dogs from the kennels and veterans from the prisons of their own minds. The grant wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. It was enough to formalize the program, to build a few proper kennels, to cover veterinary costs, to create a real, tangible thing. The climax of her journey wasn't a single, dramatic event. It was this moment of quiet, profound crystallization. All the pain, all the anger, all the fear, her own and Ranger's, had not been for nothing. It had been forged in the crucible of love and resilience into a new and powerful purpose. Her war was over, but her new mission was just beginning. 1 year later, the Daniel Boone National Forest was alive with the gentle sounds of a world at peace. Sunlight filtered through the thick canopy of late summer leaves, dappled the forest floor in shifting patterns of light and shadow. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves underfoot, the happy, panting breaths of dogs, and the low, easy murmur of human conversation. Elena walked at the head of the small group, a guide on a familiar path. She moved with an easy, confident grace, her posture relaxed, her eyes taking in the beauty of the woods around her. The hypervigilance was gone, replaced by a calm awareness. Beside her, trotting proudly with his head high and his tail held like a banner, was Ranger. He was completely off-leash, his focus entirely on Elena, their bond, an invisible, unbreakable tether of love and trust. He was no longer just a survivor. He was an ambassador. Behind them walked 5 other people, a small platoon on a mission of peace. They were the first graduates of Hearts Unleashed. There was a gruff, bearded Marine Corps veteran named Frank, who had spent years isolating himself after 3 tours in Fallujah. At his side, leaning gently against his leg with every pause, was a 3-legged pit bull named Daisy, whose goofy grin and unwavering affection had somehow breached walls Frank thought were impenetrable. There was a young woman who had been an Air Force drone pilot, haunted by the detached intimacy of modern warfare. She walked with a timid beagle mix named Copper, the same dog Elena had first sat with at the shelter. The simple, grounding act of caring for the anxious little dog, focusing on his needs, encouraging him, celebrating his small bursts of courage, had helped pull the young woman out of her own head and back into the tangible world. Each veteran had a story. Each dog had a past. Together, they were writing a new future. The group stopped to rest at a clearing, where a shallow creek gurgled over smooth grey stones. The dogs drank eagerly from the cool water, while the veterans found seats on fallen logs, sharing canteens and quiet conversation. Elena stood back and watched, a soft smile on her face. She saw the small, miraculous interactions that happened without a word. She saw Frank gently check Daisy's paws for burrs, his large, calloused hands surprisingly tender. She saw the former drone pilot kneel down and whisper encouragement to Copper as he tentatively dipped a paw in the creek. These were the victories that mattered. Small moments of connection, of empathy, of purpose. They were healing each other, man and beast, one step, one day at a time. Ranger moved through the group like a seasoned diplomat, greeting each person with a polite sniff and each dog with a calm, confident tail wag. He was the living proof that a broken past did not have to define the future. He was the heart of the program, its founding member and greatest success story. As the group prepared to head back, Elena felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. This was her new command. Not a platoon of soldiers in a war zone, but a small band of survivors navigating the often treacherous terrain of memory and trauma. Her role was no longer to patch up physical wounds under fire, but to guide her fellow veterans toward the healing that can only be found in a shared journey. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow through the trees. Elena reached down and scratched Ranger behind the ears, his favorite spot. He leaned into her, the familiar, comforting weight of him, a solid anchor in her world. She looked at the path ahead, at the small group she had brought together, at the remarkable dog who had saved her just as surely as she had saved him. Her life was no longer about the ghosts of what had been, but the promise of what could be. She was no longer just surviving. She was thriving, leading her new platoon on their most important mission yet, the long journey home to themselves. She gave a low whistle, and the group fell into step behind her. As they walked out of the woods and into the light, Elena Torres smiled. Beside her, Ranger trotted on, his spirit like hers, finally irrevocably unleashed. Never chained again. What began as a heartbreaking homecoming became a powerful journey of healing, justice, and love. Elena didn't just save Ranger, they saved each other. Her courage to stand up, speak out, and rebuild from the ashes is a reminder that no one, human or animal, deserves to be forgotten. If this story touched your heart, please like this video to honor all the soldiers and service animals who give everything for us. Share this story with someone who believes in second chances and the power of compassion. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that celebrate resilience, connection, and hope. Let Elena and Ranger's journey be more than a moment. Let it spark a movement. Because somewhere out there, someone's still waiting to be unchained.